Hi, welcome back to the Formative Assessment Podcast. This is podcast number 7. This is one I'm really proud of and also tentative about because it's my own interpretation of a lot of this work. I'm using, all of this has been to some extent, but now I'm really starting to bring together some of the ideas and the way I think about it. The thrust of this work has really been about the work of Shirley Clarke. And she has a really good kind of moniker about formative assessment. Active learning, not mechanistic strategies. Not just a checklist or a bunch of things that you do and you call formative assessment, but that you're actively doing things, the student and the teacher, to understand what's going on. And this book of hers, an earlier book, was really influential in my thinking in how to structure a lesson, because I found it, as an early teacher, I found it utterly perplexing. But as we finish this last podcast on actual practice in the classroom up and start moving to the bigger issues, I find myself turning more to Dylan Wiliam. And I want you to think about this really great phrase he has, that every teacher needs to improve, not because they're not good enough, but because they can even be better. The growth mindset isn't about the students. It's about you. It's about teachers. And what I'm trying to do in these podcasts is really provoke you, get you to think, get you to engage, and really push your understanding of what you're doing and what your expectations of what you should be seeing in a classroom will look like. So today we're going to look at planning and structuring of the learning. Now, in Shirley Clarke's book, now is when I would talk to you about plenaries. My thinking began with this kind of thought. How do we end actually the learning? What do we do at the end of a lesson? How do we end a lesson? When does the learning end? And what do we do next? Okay, so if you want to pause, you can think about those, but I'm just going to move on. We can think about summative assessment as, I would argue, as an ending. It's evaluative. It gives us a common benchmark in the form often of grades. And grades that mean something and mean something in my classroom and in your classroom and in all classrooms across the country. So it helps determine the learning of this unit. And for now, this learning is done. In contrast, how I understand formative assessment is, as opposed to evaluative, it's interpretive, it's conditional and dependent, it's comment-based, continuous, and ongoing. And the process for the student is you never stop improving, the learning never stops. When we're in, and of course, the interesting thing is summative assessments can still be used formatively, not to overly confuse you. But what we're trying to think about is, where does the learning actually stop? Now, temporally, in time, a lesson begins and ends, but the learning and the structuring of the learning is something more complex. And for me, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today brings me back to my early confusion as an early teacher of what actually is supposed to go on in a lesson. So the learning intention is to actually reflect on the structure of a lesson. And what we're going to look at is the ending versus the structuring and planning. We're going to think about a linear set of practices, a linear lesson, and something like a learning cycle. I'm going to talk about a key pillar of formative assessment, which is constant checks, and William's idea of a plan B. We're going to look at his idea of assessment, anticipating some of the later podcasts, as well as curriculum, and I'm going to share with you some things I've developed in doing this for a long time and how I kind of put together a scheme of work, because actually it's about understanding the whole process and where the lesson fits in there. And the theorist, or the scholar I want you to look at, we're going to end with, is Matt O'Leary, whose book on lesson observation is absolutely amazing. And I want to bring up a concept of his called the unseen lesson observation. And then we'll end. So to begin, we have these three models. What became very popular, I think, around the time I started the profession, it was kind of already dwindling. But when I was told, what is a lesson? A lesson is a 3-part lesson: a starter, an activity, and a plenary. This is graduated into the 4-part lesson, where we connect, we activate, we demonstrate, and we consolidate. And I found this one, which is 3 and 4, cue, do, review. I do it, we do it, y'all do it, you do it. These are all perfectly reasonable ways to get you started in thinking about a lesson. I found them as an early teacher utterly baffling because I didn't understand what it is we were supposed to do. How are we supposed to interpret these things? And I think when we think about this structure, it does help you organize yourself when you start. Okay, when I need to actually survive a 1 hour or a 100-minute lesson, this might be as good a place to start as any. But it has serious limitations, and it's because the idea here is that it's linear. It's stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, or stage 4, whatever the case may be. And the idea is that the lesson is something that I can plan on the PowerPoint, and that's something that I can create and deliver, in other words. And it's not something that's actually a process of what's going on dialogically within the classroom itself. Not only that, then this notion of planning is one where the lesson is just the standalone island or unit. And that isn't the case, right? Every lesson is part of another unit and part of a bigger picture and part of actually like those Russian dolls, like nesting units. The lesson is situated somewhere within something bigger. And further, a problem with this kind of planning or graphic representation of planning is it doesn't really acknowledge how we need to constantly be checking on and adapting to student understanding or lack of understanding, because that's really the most crucial part of structure and planning. It's not just about delivery, it's how much the students are actually learning. That is really crucial to the formative assessment process, and I would say to good teaching in general. So this is a funny book that came out a while ago now, Lazy Teacher's Handbook. I think it's really a great book. I would really recommend it to early practitioners. It's an interesting take on a lot of the formative assessment ideas, and really could boil down to this. Laziness here is you do less, so they do more. That the teacher's doing most of the learning, and that's just wrong. You should be lazy. You should create situations and planning. Lazy doesn't mean doing nothing, but lazy means they do more, you do less. I think better than linear is, I just really remember this image was really important to me because it helped me think about a cycle of learning might be a better model than a linear projection of the lesson starts here, ends here. That in fact, if we think of it as a cycle where we have a starter, then you have these circuits of outcome focused delivery, new task, learning development, learning plenary, and you keep circling in that. And then whenever the lesson goes, you have that exit point, which is the lesson end. That might be better. Okay, so that's better, but even better would be this idea that we're constantly checking within that cycle of learning. So we would have the traditional end of lesson would have a plenary. The plenary could be exit cards, quizzes, discussion. You could, you notice how I'm bringing it all together, all the things from the previous podcasts. You could check books on the visualizer and evaluate, or have the students evaluate. You could do the formal aspect of feedback, take in all the books, look at all the books, give whole class feedback. So it's either done in the same moment or on the way out or in the beginning of the next lesson. The crucial question here is, what do we do next? What do you do with the information that you collect? Because that's really what it's all about. But you shouldn't just be checking at the end of a lesson. We've come to understand that it's throughout the lesson that you should be checking. And if you have developed a talk culture, what you're doing is you have questioning constantly, and you have decision-driven data collection where you decide what kind of information you want to find out, and you design your lesson to yield that kind of information. You can use multiple choice questions, you can use randomized questioning, but what you're doing is you're constantly checking if the students are actually getting what you're delivering or teaching them. But then we also have this other idea of, like, in a very crucial moment in the learning, you might have a diagnostic question or a hinge question where all the rest, you don't move forward unless you actually come to grips with this comprehension. And what the teacher has to ask themselves is, what do I do with the information I collect? So what we don't want, which is too much of what's going on in education, is a data fetishism. So we take in all this data and we decide based on the data what we're going to do. No, instead, we decide how we're going to respond and act on what we discover. And I'm going to say even differently, that idea of decision-driven data collection, where we create situations to help give us information to then build our next steps. So the lesson is much more, not just cyclical, but that in the lesson we build a lot of moments all the time where we're checking. And in this way, the lesson is something that's alive in the lesson. Part of what that means is, of course, adaptability. So what happens when we find out? What do we do when we find out the students haven't learned the concept or the idea that we wanted to teach them? So it's really, it's very crucial in your planning to think about how you're going to adapt to this. So we've talked in previous podcasts about questions, the crucial aspect of the document visualizer as a way to correct, to model, of course, discussion and talk culture. But what we really need to think about is what do we do when the kids don't actually understand our lessons? The beginner, they start doing things like so here I'll just do myself when I was early in the profession. When you don't actually gauge understanding, and by chance you do gauge it, or you stumble across and you find out the students don't actually understand what you've been talking about, you move on to the next slide. And this is a deadly, deadly mistake, because the beginner just moves on, because the lesson for them is the PowerPoint. The lesson for them is that frozen object on the computer, and for many teachers it remains so. But instead, if we can start to think about, through formative assessment, that the lesson instead is something that's alive in the classroom, whether through talk and randomization, through listening to what the students are actually saying, through seeing what they're doing with the visualizer, we can start to adapt and respond to what's going on. If we can create multiple checkpoints, hinge, multiple choice questions, we can find really efficient ways of judging knowledge and application, and to figure out, okay, well, what is it that they need in this moment? Do they need to be retaught a concept? Do they need to go deeper into an idea? Have you forgotten a step in your teaching? And maybe you can't do that in the real time in the lesson, but maybe the next lesson you teach them. The more expert a teacher becomes, the more responsive and adaptable they become to what's going on in the classroom. And William has this idea that we need to create a plan B into our plan A, that our lesson is a kind of plan A of what's going on, but that we have the mechanisms for the plan B. And that through talk culture, through randomization, through good questioning, planned and spontaneous, more planned, by the way, something we all need to work on, through the use of the visualizer, that we can always find ways of not only checking, but maybe creating our plan B. This is from Dylan Williams. So what formative assessment essentially becomes in this context is a kind of educational positioning system, because a good teacher figures out where the students are, where they're going, and they plan a route. They begin the journey. Of course, all that's fine, but here's the key concept. We have to constantly be checking where we're going, and we make adjustments in the courses, in the course of the journey, as the conditions dictate. So a good teacher, it's these last things that are really important to moving from the lesson being something frozen and set to something that we can adapt to and change. And those units of change can develop based on your expertise. Some you can adapt in real time. Some it's going to take the next lesson. Some it's going to take the next week. Some it's going to take the next unit. And that adaptability is really the cycles of learning in not just the lesson, but in the curriculum as a whole. Okay, so what we've done is that takes us to this next moment. So we've thought about structuring and plan B. Now let's think about what are these different circuits? What are these different assessment cycles, curriculum cycles? And this is from Dylan William again. There's a long, there's a medium, and then there's the short. And we have three ways of thinking: the span, the length, and the impact. Okay, so long is across terms, teaching units, 4 weeks to a year. And these think about in terms of summative. This is monitoring and making sure that we're meeting the curriculum expectations. Medium is kind of end of unit, within and between teaching units, 1 to 4 weeks. students can be involved in that assessment. But within the lesson, we have these short cycles. And here's where it really gets crucial, what formative assessment is. It's minute by minute, day by day. It's something that stands right alongside the learning. That assessment isn't something that happens later, but it's something that we're doing all the time. And what it is it gets the students engaged and the teacher responding constantly. So that's within the lesson. That builds into a medium, that builds into a long. So this is a notion of assessment. This is going to help us think about how do we plan a lesson as an individual within a larger structure. Let's just remind ourselves about formative assessments. So where the learner's going, where they are now, how to get there. We've talked about learning intentions, the eliciting of evidence, feedback, activating peers, and activating students. The way I've done these, I started with the most complicated, which is metacognition. I kind of flipped it on its head. Again, I like the way Shirley Clark interprets this work. Of course, Dylan Williams does it the opposite way. He builds it up because metacognition is the most complex. But as you start to see, they all kind of circle back on one another. But essentially, it boils down to this. Here's the main concept. Using evidence of achievement to adapt what happens in the classroom to meet learners' needs. That is the central tenet of this pedagogy, is that we're adapting and we're meeting the students where they are, and where they haven't understood something, we act on it. And where they have understood everything, we act on it. That we're constantly acting and responding. That is really what's at the core of this pedagogy. So let's try and situate. So to do that, we need to think about the lesson in particular within a larger framework of the curriculum. So you can think about your curriculum and you can think about the entire journey. You can think about it all the way through university or becoming a scientist or an artist or a writer, whatever it may be for you. But then within more discrete notions, we think about the key stage. Within the key stage, we think about the year. And within the year, we think about the term. Okay, so once we start getting those models, and of course, we've thought about solo, learning progressions. We can think about disciplinary habits of mind. We've talked about exemplars and excellence. Within the year, we have this idea of endpoints. We're assessing recall and application. And we're adapting our schemes constantly to figure out what we've taught well, what students have learned, what they haven't learned. Within the term itself, then, we've burrowed down into something like the particulars of the knowledge, the vocabulary, skills, and applications that a student needs to know. When we place a lesson within this broader framework, we start to get a more particular notion of what a particular lesson is supposed to do. And again, I'm one who's much more drawn to the notion of progression than sequencing. Sequencing is something that's really important. I'll talk about it in the curriculum podcast. Sequencing has become very prevalent and very, the language that Ofsted uses ends up influencing the discourse of the way we start to think about so much, some for the goods, much for the worse. But here, sequencing has taken over. But I would invite you to think about progression, because over a term, what you need to think about is how are the skills, knowledge, vocabulary, and applications progressing over the term. We've talked about having exemplars, and our conception of that journey is really crucial, because the better we have that conception, the better the students can. And what we do usually at the end of a term is we have some kind of medium cycle assessment. Hopefully, halfway through, we have some kind of practice assessment so that the students so that we know where we're going and the students know where we're going. Well, the students are going to need feedback on that moment. And then prior to their practice assessment, they're going to need feedback. So already you see that once you start inserting assessment into your curriculum, there's a shape that comes to your term. When we bring in the notion of pedagogy, of formative assessment, constant checking, throughout every single lesson, you're constantly assessing and adapting to what the students are doing. And again, we have talk culture, success criteria. We're constantly giving feedback and multiple forms of assessment, and we're responding to what the students can and can't do. So that's within the lesson. Within the term as a whole, You need to have moments of formalized assessment and feedback for it to make sense. Now, this is the way, and I would thank my colleague, Shalina Khanum, for really helping. One day I was just trying to explain to her how to design a scheme of work, and she was the first person I shared this thinking with. It stayed in my head. I just thought everyone had it, and she really helped me feel more confident that this was a real model that could work. Now, of course, this is dependent on the hours that you teach in school, and of course, everyone has their own way of doing it. Nevertheless, I think my ideas here are relevant. So here we have an 8-week scheme. Okay, so what I do anyway, is I break the scheme into 2-week units of thought. And of course, now at the end, I have a clear vision of what I want the students to know at the end. What knowledge, what vocabulary, what skills and application, and the form of assessment that I will have at the end. What I do then is I figure out where I'm going to place the halfway one, conveniently at the 4-week mark. Halfway through is going to be another form of assessment. So really deep checking there. Well, of course, at week 2 and 6 are perfect places to get feedback on performance. And then what we have really essentially is a 2-week cycle of feedback to ensure that the teacher and the students know that they're on pace for the end of the 8 weeks. Then when we have a clear idea of what we want done and how we want to do it, we map on our learning intentions over those 8 weeks and our process and product success criteria, and we teach them explicitly. Every lesson does not need to have its own learning intention. Every lesson does not need to have its own individuated success criteria. But the unit overall needs to have really clear moments of teaching those aspects. So here we get one way of designing a scheme fairly quickly and with strict parameters of time and organization and thought. What we get then is moving from the scheme as a whole into particular lessons. So here's the scheme as a whole again, and the feedback that we give through learning intentions and success criteria throughout at those 2-week units. And we start to break down the 8 weeks into subunits. So we have a 2-week cycle, subunit of time, so we know where we will be at the end of 2 weeks. But we also can think about 1-week blocks. Sometimes I think about what am I going to get done this week within the larger scheme of things. And sometimes it might be just one learning intention that needs to really be pushed or one area that students aren't really understanding. But sometimes I think about what we will do in the 1 week as a subunit. So we have the 8-week, we have the key stage, we have the term, we have the 8-week unit, we have the 2-week units, the 1-week unit, and then, of course, we think about how does the individual lesson fit within these larger structures. So what I did when I was an early teacher was plan lessons. And I just planned them with starters, activities, plenary, and I just didn't have any comprehension of how things built up over time. And the department I was in didn't have schemes of work that helped me understand where we were going. And as a teacher, if I had no idea, oh, woe is me, those first students of mine, how they had absolutely no idea where things were going. And how could they? Because I was just trying to survive the single lesson. And since I was trying to structure these individual lessons without any awareness of how it fit into something larger, they were a mess. They didn't work. So now let's think about, okay, well, how do I plan an individual lesson now that I have this larger scheme of things? Well, okay, so this is one. I'm an English teacher, so I'm going to do one on Romeo and Juliet. So I decontextualize my learning intention because the idea of analyzing character is something that is done throughout English. In fact, I think I could decontextualize that even more, but for my purposes, that works fine because what we're going to do today is we want to analyze character, and we're looking at the character of Romeo. Okay, so to do that, what I'd want students to be able to do is discuss the character of Romeo, identify key moments in the play, explain his motivation, explore his relationships. Given evidence, I'd like them to find the key evidence to back up their ideas. I'd like them to analyze language and form and link this analysis to their interpretation. That, for me, would be a successful analysis. Okay, so to do that, they're going to do all these things. Okay, I should add, by the way, this isn't an hour lesson. This is a 100-minute lesson. At our school, we have 50-minute, double 50-minute lessons, which are essentially one lesson. Part of the problem with planning is that sometimes we think about double lessons or two 50-minute lessons. It's really important that you conceptualize what is the unit of a lesson. So this may seem like a lot here, but it's within 100 minutes. So in 100 minutes, these are all the things that I want them to do to meet the success criteria. And then these are kind of the ways that I would assess them. Again, this seems detailed, but if you really look at it, it's all built on talk culture, randomization, and questioning, essentially. So how would I build this all into a lesson? Well, here we go. I would use, and this is crucial, I took from Shirley Clark, once you've determined your success criteria, you should make sure your lesson teaches students how to reach those success criteria. And the only things that you should be doing in your lesson should be aimed at those success criteria. So once I know what we're doing and what success looks like, I make that success quite transparent to the students so they know that they're on the right track. Now, beyond that, I need a form of assessment, because how will I check to verify they're on the right track? I'm not just going to ask my strong students or get them to put their hands up. I need to create the means, whether it's randomized questioning, multiple choice questioning, diagnostic questioning, using the visualizer, but I'm constantly going to build in moments of checks. Then once I've done that, I've skipped a step, which is the activity. Once I know the success criteria, I know the activity they want. I want them to be able to discuss the character of Romeo, because that's essential to my lesson, which is talk partners. I want them to think about these key moments. I'm going to get them to recall their previous learning. I'm going to slow down to carefully discuss the character of Romeo and discuss the learning intention, what we're doing today, the success criteria, and the scope of the task. Now, I do that really carefully because the learning intention and the success criteria aren't these random things that are to be copied, but they need to be understood. Now, in a lot of lessons, again, Ofsted wagging the dog here, the idea of pace became really quite crucial. The idea that you should constantly be flipping activities and moving on. And I think you should be really wary of pace. I like pace if it keeps the sense of like the boiling point when you're shifting gears when you're driving. That the learning is always on point and that students are active in their engagement with what's going on, and that the teacher themselves can respond if students are losing focus, and can do things like randomized questioning, visualizer to get them back in. But I think you should, instead of trying to have a frenetic change of activities, more carefully plan the timing of what you're doing. So for me, once I know what we're doing today, the learning intention, and how I will judge success, I go into the activity and the assessment, and it was really interesting while I was writing this slide, how I kept changing the timing and the activity, because that's the way I'm reflexive of what I think can happen in the lesson. Now, I'm adaptable, because the thing is, with assessment, what will happen if they don't get it? Well, I have to build in my plan B. I have to think about how I'm going to change up. But essentially, what I'm going to do is have kind of 10 minutes of talking and recall, 10 minutes of sort of setting up the activity and modeling, then modeling analysis and the character analysis is going to take an extended period of time, and there'll be a back and forth of me modeling and them doing and me checking. And then finally, the extended task is going to become them doing something, pausing, checking to make sure they're on point, and then an extended 20 minutes of writing, so that I've set them up enough to get them on the point where I can get a solid 20 minutes. And then the plenary will be further checks, whether on the visualizer or the books at home. Once you've constructed, if you mentor a PGCE student and you see the way they kind of crowd out a lesson plan with all sorts of information that is not very helpful, what you start to think about is the more experienced you are, the more minimalist your lesson planning becomes. But sometimes we get so minimalist that you're not using success criteria and assessment to help organize what's going on in the lesson. As a result, sometimes you can lose the kind of focus of what is actually happening and at what rate. At this point in the lesson, they should be at this point. If I've checked and they haven't learned this, I'm going to have to spend more time on this. Teachers need to be able to not only articulate the learning intention, the success criteria, and how they're going to assess it, but they need to be able to understand how much time each of these tasks will take. And this is something that comes with expertise over time, and it is adaptable, and it is something that we all do in our own way. But what I'm suggesting to you is, if you take on board success criteria as informing your use of formative assessment, it can help to structure your lessons and figure out the timings and to build in the moments of checking so that you can ensure that all students meet the learning intention that you've planned. Okay, so this is a way where I draw in all these concepts into a lesson plan. Okay, and it's minimalist, and I don't like the way this looks on PowerPoint. I prefer it in Word. I would make it much more stripped back. For me, the crucial aspect is going to be the time. So all of that is a way of saying that it's really difficult, near impossible, to think about the individual lesson plan without positioning it within the long, medium, and short-term notion of assessment and curriculum. And the clearer idea a teacher has of where the individual lesson meets the larger portions of the curriculum, the better the lesson is going to be speaking to the larger learning intentions and success criteria of your subject as a whole. Now, if you can learn to then do a minimalist lesson plan, what we can then start to think about is something that Matt O'Leary calls the unseen lesson observation. So Matt O'Leary, this is from 2013. This is absolutely just excellent book. I think everyone who has to observe teachers or would like to understand what's at stake with classroom observation should read this book. I think all teachers should read this book. This is an exemplary book on this topic, and the political, the pedagogical, the emotional implications of observation. This is I cannot recommend Matt O'Leary's work highly enough. He's got this great idea of the unseen observation, and I'd love for you to, you can explore it yourself, or you can just take my word for it. Two teachers. One is the teacher, and for him, he uses the language of the supervisor. Okay, so the teacher identifies the focus. Always, I think that's really important. I think Dylan Williams says this too. I'm going to add kind of like a vampire. A vampire has to be invited into the room. I think that with observation, the teacher has control. The teacher is the one that identifies what it is that they want to work on. And the observer, the supervisor, is the person invited into that journey. The teacher prepares a lesson plan. And I would want a lesson plan with success criteria, activities, assessment, and times. And I would encourage that to be the standard. And it does not need to be a PGCE lesson plan with every single mini idea and concept and differentiate, every single minutiae, not at all. Simply, what is success? What is the task? How will you assess success is met? What amount of time will be spent on each of these tasks? That is given to be commented on. A face-to-face meeting takes place where the supervisor discusses and gives feedback on the plan. The teacher produces the final lesson plan based on the supervisor feedback and teaches the lesson. The supervisor does not need to see the lesson, but what the teacher needs to do is reflect on the lesson, take notes on it, take notes always on what works, what doesn't work, what did you notice, and then they meet again to have a professional dialogue on what's happened, And the teacher writes it up as a series of feed-forward action points. Okay, well, based on what we've talked about, what we planned, how I delivered it, how we fed back, what am I going to do next time? This is the unseen lesson observation, and it is less onerous and less emotive than the traditional observation. I think that classroom observation can be a very problematic idea if we think back to the things I've talked about with Robert Cohen, proxies of learning, biases of the observer, what are differing expectations of what is supposed to happen in a lesson. It can become a highly problematic activity with almost too much data coming at the observer. I was just thinking about when I was doing this, but how many observations take place where the learning is actually disrupted, where leaders will start to interview students or look very closely at their book. And what's happening there is the teacher is distorting the learning in a way in the hopes of gathering data on what's going on. And that is problematic. Classroom observation is problematic in so many ways. But in addition to the fact that I think peer observation is a way forward, maybe unseen observations might be another way forward as a way of putting pressure on our practice and a way for each of us to develop and to mentor one another in growing our practice, in adapting and instilling the principles of formative assessment, and to help us engage in professional dialogue and better discussions, as Jim Knight calls it, into how to improve and to make ourselves supportively accountable to one another about how we think about structuring our lessons and how we want to improve. Okay, so today we've reflected on the structure of a lesson, and I've provoked you to think about how, what does it even mean to end a lesson, and how that might be a dangerous or kind of incorrect concept, and to think about learning not as a linear cycle, but linear process, but more of a cycle, and that within that cycle, that we're constantly checking in multiple ways, and then with that checking, that we are ready to act on a plan B if students don't understand what it is that we wanted them to understand. Part of that is to think about assessment in the long term, the medium term, and the short term. To understand what a lesson is, we have to understand how the lesson fits within the term, fits in the key stage, and how the curriculum is integrated in that way. And I shared with you the way I plan a scheme of work, and then how the individual lesson fits within that schema. And then finally, I invited you to think about Matt O'Leary's unseen lesson observations. Again, really great idea. This is the 7th of the podcast I've been doing on formative assessment, and it's the last one pretty much on classroom practice and on the actual ways that we are in the classroom. And what I want to do is, in the next one, I've been thinking about kind of calling it quits, but this coronavirus is stimulating the mind in so many ways. And where I'm at now is thinking about taking some of these concepts of formative assessment and thinking about leadership. And what I want to look at are, now I want to move from Shirley Clark really into Dylan Williams. And I want to look at 2 documents that he produced for the SSAT, one on curriculum, one on assessment. I want to think about formative assessment and curriculum. I want to think about formative assessment and assessment itself. I want to think about Dylan Williams' excellent book on leadership for learning. And then if we're still locked down and I still have the energy, I want to think about a hot topic right now, which is science, psychology, and learning. So to end, I'm just going to bring you back to this document that I produced and I've shared with you in a number of these podcasts, which is the criteria by which I would judge a good lesson and the descriptors of those. And I want you to go away and think about how you could use formative assessment for your scheme and lesson planning, how you might be able to use unseen observation to peer observe and improve practice in a less time-taxing way. And I want you to think about how if these podcasts are helping you develop a common language for what you want in your own classroom and the expectation of the classrooms that you walk into, that you have to manage, or that you share with other people, that you want to invite people into looking at yours and you want to look at theirs. how will these concepts and ideas help inform your practice? Thank you very much for giving me your time. I hope that some of this is helping you think about and understand formative assessment. And for those of you who were as perplexed as I was early career, I hope this helps you start thinking about how to plan a lesson. Talk to you soon.